This is a special coronavirus edition of the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. My name is Ben Catania. I am your host. This is my show where we go long form about risk and uncertainty across all aspects and walks of life. This is a special coronavirus COVID-19 edition of the show. Before we get into our guest, Daniel Wagner, who's been on the show many times, I wanted to touch on something that has been on my mind and actually has been making me fairly angry. I've been seeing in social media a prominent influencer, someone who's got millions of followers on YouTube and elsewhere, and I'm not going to name this person because I don't want to give them any more airtime, attempt to be edgy and contrarian and controversial as well as inspirational, and in so doing has said the following about the coronavirus. This person said, "The sooner we all get this, the better." And this person takes photos on Instagram walking around London doing the exact opposite of social distancing, telling people not to be afraid. And he's trying to be brave and macho. And some of the comments in the comment sections of these videos say things like, "So inspiring, true leadership. Thank you for this great message. This is what the world needs to hear." And it makes me angry because this is anything but inspirational. It is irresponsible bullshit. And the assumption, of course, that this person is making is that people are staying home out of fear. And perhaps there is some of that, the panic buying, all of that. But most people are staying home not for fear for themselves, because let's face it, the coronavirus has a low fatality rate, although it is quite high for the elderly, but they are doing so out of love for the most vulnerable people in the world, as well as compassion for the healthcare workers and those on the front lines of this disease. If we don't suppress COVID-19, our healthcare systems around the world will collapse. And we know that this thing spreads exponentially. One person infecting 3, which is what happens on average, that person infecting 3, and do that 10 times, 59,000 will have become infected from that one person. There are not enough intensive care units, respirators, and all of those things to take care of the most vulnerable. This is about saving lives, and this is why flattening the curve is so important. And the real heroes, the true heroes, of course, are those on the front lines and the healthcare workers. They aren't some influencer on social media. So I got to thinking about whether or not this person was stupid. In fact, no, I'm sure he gets this. In fact, I think there's something more insidious going on. And it's a little bit like those spam emails that we still get, those so-called Nigerian scams, although now they come from all types of countries and have all types of backstories. And if you notice those types of spam emails, there's spelling and grammar mistakes. And you might think that those are unintentional. They're actually very deliberate. What the people who are perpetrating these scams do is that they're qualifying their leads. People that can't see past those errors make great targets because they're the most gullible. They have the fewer critical thinking skills. And I actually think that's exactly what's going on with some of these influencers, and particularly this guy who sells overpriced courses, events, and other things, and doing things that are so blatantly stupid, like putting lives at risk. This guy is trying to find the most gullible under normal circumstances. That would be the people that are harmed by buying something that is kind of worthless. And so you're qualifying poor, gullible customers. Of course, these are not normal circumstances. We have systemic risk. Everyone is a systemic risk. So every copycat that occurs because someone is following a prominent social influencer will cost lives. And I wouldn't want anyone's father or mother, for instance, to be left to die because there aren't enough respirators in some hospital because some idiot was following a social influencer. It makes me angry. I don't know what to do about it, but I will repeat that everyone is a systemic risk at this time. And I think in this crisis, we need to call out the bullshit when we see it. And so I'm calling it out. And I ask you to do the same. Listen to the experts, practice social distancing, and take care of one another. Also connect with others. And there are a number of ways in which we can do this and do that more effectively. Perhaps we'll talk about that on a number of other episodes. Do practice self-care as well. So with that out of the way, I would love to get into the conversation that we've got for you today. It's with Daniel Wagner. Daniel is the CEO of Country Risk Solutions. He's been on the podcast multiple times. He is the author of several books on risk, on geopolitics, on US-China relations, cyber security, virtual terror, and a range of other things. And we use this podcast episode to explore some of the broader questions about COVID-19, how we got here, the role of China, the geopolitical implications, and what to expect. And for context, this episode was recorded Sunday, the 22nd of March. That was 2 days ago. So some things will have moved on, but I think there are a number of important questions that we raise here. So let's get into it. Here is Daniel Wagner. Enjoy. Daniel, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. And this is a special COVID-19 edition of the podcast. And what better person to have to talk about the wider global implications than Daniel Wagner. So welcome back.
Always a pleasure, my friend. I wish it was under better circumstances this time.
Indeed, indeed. And these are incredibly trying and interesting times. But I wanted to have you on the show because in the midst of all of the noise about social distancing and the messages to stay home and policies, what I am not seeing enough of, because we're in this firefighting mode, let's be honest, but what we're not seeing much of is taking a step back and thinking about the wider implications of all this on the world. And that's what I wanted to talk about.
Let's do it.
So let's put a little bit of context around this, because a few years ago, you wrote a book called Global Risk Agility. And that book talked about the confluence between nature and human risk. And this seems like a pretty apt example of that. So as this unfolds with that backdrop, what do you make of it from a contextual perspective?
Yes, so for those of your listeners who may not know, I wrote Global Risk Agility with my friend Dante Disparte, who's currently the vice chairman of Libra. And at the time we wrote this and published it in 2016, the confluence, as you say, between man-made and natural risk was not really very focused upon and very widely acknowledged. And in the book, we talked about how it has obvious impacts with climate change, and pandemics was one of the subtopics. What this is all about is the clash between man-made and natural risk in what we call the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene era really started post-World War II, and it's the impact that man-made activities have on the world around us, the natural world, and also how they feed upon themselves and cascade in the globalized world that we live in, because, everything is connected to everything else. So what pandemics then have an opportunity to do, as we're seeing in real time right now, is cascade into, politics and economics, social indicators, all sorts of things that people aren't necessarily accustomed to thinking about in terms of those connections. So what's important, I think, here is to focus upon the broad swath of impacts that is going to take place here. We're working through it now, of course, but we're only really just at the starting gates, and we're only really just getting some sort of an idea on just how cataclysmic this could turn out to be. One way that it could be cataclysmic, of course, is to all the population centers of the world, the cities. And I want to point you to the City Risk Index, which has been published since 2015 by Lloyd's and Cambridge University. And what this index does is it looks at the biggest 15 risks that any city can face, both natural and man-made. And apart from market crashes, which could have the most significant effect, over $1 trillion of effect on the world's largest cities, human pandemic is next. And Lloyd's and Cambridge University estimated a year or so ago that there could be up to $600 billion of impact. And that's just direct impact on cities. It's not talking about countries or smaller communities. So I think we're all getting a sense of just how serious this could be. I'm recording this from Connecticut in the U.S., and I can tell you that as of Friday, my state went on lockdown. All the restaurants and schools are closed, and basically all non-essential businesses are closed, and non-essential workers are forbidden to go to work. I think that's something that needs to happen nationwide. And I think we're going to explore throughout the course of this hour part of the reason why that isn't happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm here in London, and we are really late to the party on this. And the pubs have remained open up until yesterday. And people are out and about still and not really coming to terms with the gravity of the situation. So our rates of infection are on a par with Italy 2 weeks ago, but we don't have the lockdown measures that Italy put in place. So there's every possibility that in the coming weeks, the UK will see the curve get steeper, which is very alarming.
I think it's worth pointing out, and that I heard over the weekend a report that was describing the comments of the head of the Chinese Red Cross, who was paying a visit to northern Italy for their epicenter of the virus. Mm-hmm. And he was looking at all the things that the Italian government has done so far. And that's pretty draconian, right? I mean, they were very, very late getting to this. And of course, the joke was going around that, Italians spend so much time hugging and kissing that they don't have time to worry about stuff like this. And that's exactly right? That's part of the reason they're in the trouble that they're in. But what he said was that despite all the draconian things the Italian government has done, lockdowns and quarantines and all this stuff, it's not nearly enough, he said, based on the Chinese experience. So what the Italian government has now gone on to do is restrict people from even walking outdoors, for example. And they're really, really going to tighten up. Now, if you take the U.S. and the U.K. and where we are now, in the U.S., we've got maybe half a dozen states that have put these quarantines in effect. And that means, we've got 44, 45 states that have not. I don't know what the figures are in the UK, but both of our countries are so far behind the curve on this thing that it's just going to get out of control very, very quickly, just in a matter of a week or two.
I read just today that Australia is on course for running out of ICU units by the 7th of April, based on current trends, which means effectively people will die unnecessarily. So this is serious. So could we go into the origins of this a little bit and talk about China and what China did? Among the things that they did is built, I think it was 2 hospitals over the course of 10 days when this thing started to explode in Wuhan.
Yeah, that's right. So I think people are mostly familiar with the story that apparently this first became known to the Chinese government on or around December 1st. That doctor in Wuhan blew the whistle, and of course he was ostracized for doing so and penalized and all that. And unfortunately he died, which is a testament really to all those millennials and Gen Zers out there who are thinking this doesn't really apply to them. It certainly does. one of the things that really upset me, not only about how the Chinese government originally reacted, but how the WHO reacted, was they were so busy patting themselves on the back and congratulating them about all great things they've done in relation to this, which of course wasn't even true at the time, that they were both wasting precious time and they were, both letting this thing spin wildly out of control around the world. I don't know if you're aware, but WHO General Director Tedros met with Xi in Beijing on the 26th of January and was praising Xi profusely about all the wonderful things the Chinese government has done to try to get this thing under control. And you realize that it wasn't even until the week after, on the 3rd of February, that the Chinese government put Wuhan under quarantine, which was its first quarantine, right? They deserve credit for doing that, and it was the largest quarantine of its kind in history and all that stuff. But, they could have done that 2 months earlier, right? If they had paid attention to what was going on and believed people instead of tried to sweep it under the rug. Another thing that really angers me about the WHO response to this thing, and we're going to talk about China as well, of course, is that I did some research and I actually wrote an article on this. And it turns out that Tedros, the head of the WHO, is Ethiopian. And Ethiopia and China have this really tight relationship, and China is the largest investor in Ethiopia. And I got to believe that there's a connection here between his unwillingness to call this a global pandemic or criticize China in any way and the connection between these two countries. It wasn't until March 11th, just less than 2 weeks ago, that the WHO finally called this a global pandemic. And do you know at that point in time how many countries already had active COVID cases? 114 countries. So I found myself wondering, what is it going to take for the WHO to call this a pandemic and start focusing people's attention on this thing? I was just mystified by the whole thing. So this raises question about, the relationships between multilateral organizations and individual governments and, the rich and the powerful and all that kind of thing, which is certainly worth talking about perhaps more in a different context. But as we know, when China decided to really buckle down and get this thing moving in the right direction, they did so as no other government in the world can do. And as we were getting reports in the West that Wuhan was under quarantine, basically what was happening is the entire country was more or less under quarantine. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party had the ability to have minders in every village all the way up through Beijing and be able to, to put this thing into place and manage it properly. And as a result of that, now, 6 weeks, 2 months later, they've finally gotten a handle on this thing. So you start asking yourself, is that something that the American and the British government, for example, are going to be able to do? I don't see how we're going to be able to do it. I mean, unless you say martial law and shut the countries down for 2 months, which is probably what it'll take to really start having an impact on this thing. And I don't know that the U.S., certainly the U.S., the current U.S. administration doesn't have the wherewithal to do that. I doubt the Johnson administration in the U.K. does either. Maybe you'd like to comment on that. But I'm just blown away at how this was initially handled by China, and then also blown away by what a fabulous job they did at the end of the day, right? Sort of a tale of two cities, if you will.
Well, very, very much yin and yang. Excuse the pun. So the causes of not having that level of transparency and not getting to grips with this thing early, that, according to what you were saying, seems to have its origins in the structure, the authoritarian structure of the system of Chinese governance. Is that what you would suggest?
It is. And it's interesting also how few lessons appear to have been learned in China by the Chinese government, where any number of previous regional and global infections have originated from. I mean, this is not a new problem. This is an old problem. If you look back at the last two global pandemics that we had, which is in 1957 and 1968, they were respectively the the Asian and Hong Kong flus, right? And Hong Kong at the time wasn't officially part of China, but anyway, now both they are. The last two global pandemics originated then from either China or Hong Kong. And the SARS epidemic originated, of course, from China. So I find myself wondering, why is it that they allow live animal markets to continue to exist? Looking at what's happened, I don't understand. And will they continue to exist after this one? I can't speak to the importance, perhaps, of live animal markets to the Chinese or Asians more generally. I know that they certainly relish, freshly killed animals because they apparently taste better, and then you also don't have to worry about whether they were fresh or not. But look at the price that's being paid. And why aren't we collectively as a world, why isn't the Chinese government then also learning important lessons and acting accordingly? That's what I don't understand here.
That's the question, right? Because what's the motivation for that? I suppose is traditional Chinese medicine may be a factor. In the Ebola case, which, as far as I'm aware, migrated from, I guess, bushmeat to humans via. I would only imagine that its scarcity of food or possibly a bit of a culture of hunting wild bushmeat. But in China, with the development that it's had, is there really a need for that?
Yeah, that's a fair question, I would suppose. I think there's some traditionalism about all of this and some inherent value in culture about having live animal markets in China. Obviously, if it wasn't inherently perceived as valuable to them, I suppose they would have shut them down quite some time ago.
Sure.
Well, I guess it's a question of how much pain is being applied. I mean, this is by far going to be, it appears, the most painful pandemic, apart from maybe loss of life, but on every other metric, with all the quarantines and the economic catastrophe, et cetera, that anybody's ever experienced or perhaps will experience going forward. So you do have to wonder where the breaking point is, and maybe this is it.
Now, on the flip side, China acted, once they got their act together, they're quite robustly, and with its authoritarian system of governance was able to do a lot of things that one would argue we couldn't do in the West. So maybe we could contrast those two things a little bit and also talk about some of the countries that actually have performed quite well. Taiwan and Korea and Singapore. But the kinds of things that China did once it was obvious what was happening to get this under control, and maybe contrast that with what we are seeing in other parts of the Western world.
Yeah, well, anyone who's spent a fair amount of time in Asia, as you and I both have, will understand why many of the Asian countries are getting it right, particularly subsequent to the Chinese example, right? They just have the ability to mobilize their populations and their resources very, very efficiently and rapidly. They think ahead, they plan ahead. The Chinese, of course, plan decades ahead for most everything that they do. Good for them. We could learn a lot on that basis. And by contrast, I think it's very clear, not just in the US, not just in the UK, but throughout much of the rest of the world, that we just aren't planning. We aren't as effective in mobilizing resources. We don't have as compliant populations, for example, as they do in, say, China and Singapore, right? Part of the reasons the governments continue to be robust in these places is because they have a compliant population which goes along with the game plan. And obviously there are enough pluses associated with doing that for the population that they do it. But you try and emulate that in the U.S., for example, where we have a highly litigious society and a lot of free thinkers and a democratic form of government and all these things which just spell marching in the opposite direction. The other thing is, I think we've got a couple of generations now of people who haven't really spent much time either focused on or participating in wars. They haven't there's a whole generation of people, Gen Zers and millennials, who really have known virtually no adversity in their lives. And this is all very new to them, but so is the idea of, working in unison toward a common problem when everybody wants to march to their own band. All these things sort of conspire, if you will, I think, to create the dilemma that we have today.
Mm-hmm. And if we maybe think about some of the technology that China's also applied to this thing, it's quite amazing. I saw a video of a woman being chased down a road by a drone because she wasn't wearing a face mask, or facial recognition technology that circumvents face masks. It's amazing.
And what do you need to be able to do that? You need, superiority, supremacy, and artificial intelligence, as we've spoken about before. Mm-hmm. You need, massive police and military resources, which of course they have in abundance. And, it does help that China is the most highly surveilled society in the world. And then of course, they have the social credit system. The government knows a lot about a lot of people. They know where they live. They know what they do. They know where they are at any given moment. And you could say, the same might be true in the U.S. or UK or elsewhere where, a police force decides to find out where a specific person is through cell phones and triangulation and all that sort of thing. But the Chinese government has put all of that on steroids, right? Mm-hmm. They're just, incredible in that regard.
Yeah.
But that's another important point, I suppose, to this whole equation, which is if we ever got to the point where there was nationwide lockdowns in these countries and the government was inclined to enforce it and had the ability to enforce it, would they? Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, unfortunately, in America, we've still got a president who's in a state of denial about this whole thing. And we've got a government which is hugely underprepared and is way, way, way behind the curve, even though it's had 2 to 3 months of notice that this was coming down the pike. It's really just inexcusable.
Let's talk about the U.S. for a moment. I do want to talk a little bit about testing as well, but I cannot imagine what it would be like to be a health expert like that. Dr. Fauci, is it?
Fauci, yeah.
Fauci, in the Trump administration, trying to, on the one hand, get a handle on what is a very complex, very high stakes, very difficult crisis, and at the same time have to deal with President Trump and his narcissism and his way of looking at things.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's funny because, well, it's not funny, but it's funny in the way that there's a video going around this weekend of, a camera pointed on Fauci during Friday's news conference with Trump and co. And Fauci's face is just worth 1,000 words. It's like, I can't believe I'm in this position, right? He is, if you will, America's doctor at the moment, and he's widely revered and respected and trusted. And he's walking a very unfortunate tightrope. On one hand, he's a health professional. And he has to say exactly what the story is and is not. On the other hand, as you're suggesting, he's having to walk this tightrope and walk on these eggshells with this, narcissistic president who can't stand an ounce of criticism and can never be told by anybody that he works with that he's doing anything wrong. So what a difficult position to be in. I actually wrote a piece a few days ago. Let me back up a second before I say that. Back in July of 2016, I wrote a piece where I basically suggested that Mr. Trump had a psychological disorder called narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. And it turns out, very few people, if anyone, had sort of put this in writing at the time. And subsequently, tens of thousands of mental health professionals have said, yeah, that's actually what this guy has. So I suggested that we create a new subtitle, a title for what his disorder is. And I suggested calling it delusional NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, because this man really is delusional. How is it that he could stand a month ago in front of the American people and say, we've got 15 cases, it's going down to 0, everything's fine? I mean, anybody who watches the news, reads a newspaper, has a discussion with people, would know that's not going to happen, right? And now, here he is, as of Friday, talking about how everything's under control and everything's going to be fine. Well, it's not. And the markets know that. And the markets are reacting accordingly. I mean, we're seeing these 30, 40% declines in the space of 3 weeks on the world's markets. How much lower can we go? How much lower will we go? Do we need to go until it accurately reflects what we're actually dealing with here? The Wall Street Journal this past week seems to think that we have another 40% to go. I hope it's only 40% because the unemployment rate is going to be skyrocketing starting this coming week. We went from having maybe a couple of 100,000 unemployment claims last week to having 2 million expected in the coming week. And that's just the beginning.
That's insane. I was talking to some Americans earlier this week, and one in particular who she was saying, oh, my employer is great because they've encouraged me to take some vacation days now to stay at home. And I was flabbergasted. Like, how many vacation days do you possibly have before they start to run out and your employer will start to need to cut wages and hours and let people go and all of this kind of thing?
More to the point, why should you be required to use a single vacation day?
Absolutely.
When, and I mean, this hits close to home. I know people here who have CEOs of their companies who refuse to let anybody work from home, even in the situation that we're in, even in the statewide lockdown that we've got here in Connecticut. There are companies that are not abiding by it, or at least they're not going to be abiding by it in the coming week. So I think a big part of the problem here, Ben, what compounds this also, is that you're basically trying to corral, if you will, 50 different countries in this country, right? Each state has their own governor, their own mayors. They have, their own preferred way of doing things. And I wrote a piece, a week or so ago also. I've been writing a lot on this stuff, as I think you know, where I was basically saying, all you governors and mayors, CEOs of companies, don't wait for divine guidance from the American government because you're not going to be getting it. Take action yourselves and do it now. And fortunately, some of them have started listening.
And how does the lack of universal health care factor into this?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So Bernie seems to be out of the race now for the Democratic nomination. And a lot of the drums that he's been beating are now beating more loudly among one number of people, if you will, as a result of this. If we had universal health care, I suppose it would make the task somewhat easier. But of course, it would also have placed additional burdens financially on businesses and individuals in the process. And so it's this trade-off, which you in the UK are very familiar with, which we're just sort of starting to get our hands around a little bit. Also interesting to note that everybody and their mother in this country seems to have their hands outstretched to the American government, trying to say, we need a bailout. These are tens of thousands of businesses, all the airlines, all the hotel companies, even Boeing, right, is coming and saying we need a bailout. Now, the American government can't possibly give all these businesses and all these individuals a bailout. They're going to have to choose. The package that's been arranged so far is about $2 trillion worth, or at least that's what's expected. There is word on the street now that probably we're going to need double that in order to try to meet most people's and most businesses' needs. I don't know how we do this. I mean, how can we just keep printing money ad nauseum, not only in this country, but on a global basis? We're just digging ourselves into this incredible financial hole that we're probably never going to be able to get out of. And then what does that say? Are we just going to get rid of all the currencies and wipe out all the debt and start over again? And what are the implications of doing something like that? It's just mind-boggling to even think about.
Yeah, it is mind-boggling. I continue to think as the days pass that we have no idea in the aggregate what's coming over the next few weeks. And I've seen, I'm talking also, I mean, the situation you describe in the U.S. is alarming. I think it's alarming here as well, where people continue to ignore guidance on social distancing. And we were talking just before we went on air about the UK's infection rate and death rate, and it is about as steep as Italy's without the lockdowns.
Well, right. And I've been keeping track of the growing numbers of infected and dead around the world through some of the indices that are out there. And fortunately, I guess it's fortunately, although this is still pretty high, previous flu pandemics or things like this have had maybe 0.5 to 1% death rates. That's certainly the case with the previous two pandemics. That's not the case here. It looks to be somewhere between 4 and 4.5%. And of course, among the older population, it's much, much higher, maybe even 10% or higher for the 80 pluses, for example, which is part of the reason why Italy has such a high mortality rate. It's certainly possible that this could end up killing millions of people around the world. I doubt, based on what I've read, that this is going to be anything like the Spanish flu 100 years ago. But it's going to be something like most of us have never seen in our life and probably never will see again.
What should the West and the countries that are coming to grips with this now, what should they be doing?
Well, if I had my way, I would have the entire world go on lockdown for a minimum of 30 days, ideally 60 days. How would we possibly do that? I know it sounds ridiculous on its face, but if you don't do that, how do you stop the method of transmission? You may really make a dent in one country, but what about your neighboring countries? What about people who get on airplanes and boats and trains and spread it to somewhere else? I don't know that we have much choice, Ben, if we're really going to try to get a handle on this, but to basically do what China has done. And in essence, they ended up shutting down the country for more or less 2 months. Only now are people there sort of venturing out, and are they trying to get back to normal? And it's interesting to note, you have a Goliath-like Chinese economy that was, humming at supposedly 6%, although we can't really necessarily believe that number. For years on end, double digits prior to that. You had the U.S. economy, which was growing at 2.5%, 3.5% unemployment. It's astonishing and very, very noteworthy to me just how fast this house of cards has come tumbling down, isn't it? Isn't it amazing? We've had nothing but, an upward draft for the last 10 years in the world stock markets. And in the space of about 3 weeks, it's all come crashing down. It's just astonishing.
It is astonishing. And even more astonishing is that it started with the transmission of a virus, some molecules from an animal to a human, the tiniest of particles a few months ago. That's amazing.
It just goes to show Mother Nature is the absolute ruler of our fortunes. And, it's not like this is the first time that this has ever happened, of course, but it's the first time in most of our lives that it's happened. And it's a real wake-up call. One of the things that we had talked about in Global Risk Agility was, what it's going to take for governments to really focus on this issue. And perhaps maybe one of the few pieces of good news about this is that there can be little doubt that every government in the world now is going to be focused on this issue after this pandemic.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep. I remember being in attendance in a panel discussion in 2008 about the global financial crisis, late 2008. And it was in the city, and there were a bunch of bankers there. And in the Q&A, one of the bankers got up and asked, when are we going back to normal? And the universal response from the panel was, we aren't. And that's, I think, where we are right now.
Well, we aren't until we are, right? Because let's take the example of the Great Recession. You would have thought after that calamity that hearts and minds would be focused for many, many years to come. But in reality, I think you would agree, it didn't take that long for the financial markets to basically say, oh, phew, glad that's over.
They're all bailed out.
Let's get back to business as usual, right?
Yeah.
And that's what happened, right? And then, not entirely, but people have short memories, right? And some of the risk management metrics that were in place to keep tabs on things and the regulations that were in place, they slowly got whittled away by the lobbyists and the special interest groups and all that stuff. I can tell you that's certainly true in Washington. So I guess you can say it's human nature to want to have a short memory on this stuff, but we can't afford to going forward. We really couldn't afford to then, and we certainly can't afford to now.
I do want to talk about where things go from here, but I also want to talk about a piece that you wrote around sanctions with sanctions on Iran and what that means now with the crisis and how badly hit Iran has been, and whether or not it's a moral obligation for those sanctions to be relaxed in a number of areas so that we don't, so the people in Iran don't suffer unnecessarily, but also, given the interconnectedness that we've been talking about, it's quite possibly in the U.S.'s interests to do so.
Yeah, indeed. So, first of all, let me say that I'm actually in favor of having sanctions on Iran because they're a bad actor in the region, and they're a menace, and they're doing some things that are not very helpful for countries in the region and around the world. So, with that said, it's very clear that the most negatively impacted from any sanctions are the people. You could certainly say that either about Iran or North Korea or Cuba, for that matter. And it seems to me that there's really no choice from a humanitarian perspective, but for the Trump administration to say, yeah, we're not going to let up on all of the restrictions, but we're going to lighten up on the restrictions on medicines and medical-related items. And we're also going to lighten up on what constitutes acceptable financing for those things. In the piece, I noted that, something like 95% of Iran's medicines are produced locally. They tend to be of inferior quality because they're sourced from inferior foreign sources. And at the end of the day, you've got a population which has 30% inflation going on, huge unemployment. People don't have money, right? So they're reliant on their government. The government can only produce so much. It can only provide so much. So what would be the harm, really, for a few months in lightening up on that aspect of the sanctions? And I say that because, again, on Friday, Secretary of State Pompeo had basically said, nope, we're not letting up on anything. I just think that's the wrong approach. And if America wants the Iranian people to, be behind it and supportive, why don't they show that they're actually supportive of the people in their time of need? That's my basic message.
Right. And any failure in Iran to contain this thing is, becomes a global failure, which I actually want to discuss a little bit. What I'm not hearing enough of is the conversation around what happens to countries like India, to countries like the Philippines, to countries in Africa, a place like Nigeria, places that do not have the healthcare system to manage this thing. And once this thing starts to spread in those countries, who knows what the true cases versus the confirmed cases are and where the exposure remains. I see a nightmare for all of that, for travel to any of these countries.
Yeah, I have to agree in general, although I would say it's worth pointing out a few things. One is that in some respects, countries in Africa probably have a jump on the US and the UK in terms of their ability to mobilize their populations, for the simple reason that they don't necessarily have to have a huge amount of discussion. They're open to receiving aid. They're happy to do what they're told by international authorities. They don't presumably have delusional presidents. And all of that, gives them an inherent advantage, I would argue. That all said, I can tell you from my brief time living in Africa last year, which we previously discussed, that I can tell you the first thing that the people at the African Development Bank told me was, if you get seriously ill, just leave the country. And that's before you have a global pandemic. So I feel very badly for those countries which have very few resources and ability to mobilize the aid that they get, et cetera, in an effective manner. But there's going to be so many millions of people that are going to be impacted on the African continent that are really going to have no options. And a lot of them are going to die, unfortunately.
Similarly, it's the fact that a lot of them are going to die and that populations will continue to be infected, quite possibly long after the virus is under control in other parts of the world, enhances that global vulnerability.
Exactly right. And you do have to ask also the question, how long can desperately poor countries stay closed down? They're the ones who can least afford to do that for any length of time. And yet they would probably be the ones who are willing to do it first, right? Rather than the US and the UKs of the world, which are going to try and do everything they can to wiggle out of it or delay it as long as possible, when in fact that should be happening immediately, as we've discussed.
Shouldn't we just be testing for this thing everywhere? If we
Absolutely.
Could. And don't we have... go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, there's a small town in Italy called Bo. And what they did, it's a town of 3,300 people. They tested everyone. And then they found out who was infected. Then they isolated them. Then a little bit of time went by. They retested. And in doing so, they isolated everybody who needed to be isolated, and everybody else sort of did what they needed to do, and they got a real handle on this thing. That's the big problem that we have now. Yes, eventually millions of tests will be available in places like the US and the UK. Great. We need it desperately, just like everybody else does. But we're never going to be able to test everybody in the country all at one time. It's just not going to happen. China could do it, right? They have the ability to do it. But most every country is only testing people who have symptoms.
Right.
And of course, that's the nature of this beast, isn't it? Because you can be asymptomatic and spreading this thing. It's a big, big part of the problem.
Well, I've also spoken to people this week who say that they've had some mild symptoms, a dry cough, a fever, and then they got better, but they don't know if it was coronavirus or just the flu.
And they didn't get tested, right?
And they didn't get tested, so they don't know. They perhaps will never know.
Well, they will if they get secondary symptoms, because apparently about a week after you have those initial symptoms is when the chickens can come home to roost and you get very, very sick. In this country also, of course, as of I think next week, we're pretty much out of ICU beds. In Japan, I think they have a total of 2,000 ICU beds. Just astonishing, right? In a highly developed, wealthy country like that.
Well, this is the thing.
Most countries in the world, they aren't prepared for stuff like this.
Exactly, and this is the thing. If you have people that have heart attacks or other ailments, you've got healthcare professionals that have got to make these choices between who lives and dies effectively.
And that's exactly right, and it's a very, very difficult for health professionals, difficult position for them to be put in, and you will have to choose. It's sort of like wartime. You're going to have to say this person is this age and is this reasonable health, and they have a chance to recover, whereas this person has an underlying condition and is 80 years old and basically doesn't have much chance to recover. That's what it's going to come down to. And the other thing, Ben, that I think is worth pointing out is, of course, neither you nor I are health professionals, and we're not particular experts on this subject, but we just have a point of view, and we've been doing as much reading as the next person. And that is that there's a pretty good chance, especially based on the history of the last two pandemics, that this is going to endure for between 1 and 2 years. And we're going to experience rolling waves of infection by country, by region. And we can keep getting reinfected, in particular because there's, as of what we know now, there's 2 strains of this thing. And it's still too soon to say whether if you've had one strain, you can even be reinfected by the same strain.
And there are 2 strains now, but how many more will there be down the track?
Well, that's right. And is this going to be the type of virus that sort of mutates and we get some sort of a remedy for it, and then we get a new form of it and have to start all over again? This is the sort of thing that could cripple economies for just months on end. I think the economic calamity as well as the health calamity to societies all over the world is potentially immense.
Well, we haven't even talked about that yet, and I do want to touch on the global economy. And you're not seeing much by way of commentary on this, but as far as I can tell, I think Goldman Sachs came out with some estimates saying that the Q2 impact on the global economy was something like minus 15% growth.
I think it was minus 24.
Minus 20. Okay, there you go. That's insane. That is, nearly a quarter of the world's wealth, real wealth that is eroded.
I'm not sure whether that number was for the U.S. or for the world, but you might as well just add another double-digit figure for the world if it was meant for the U.S.
It's big.
Exactly right.
We don't. I mean, those estimates are still finger in the air at this point, but we do know it will be big, and that's on a par with the Great Depression.
Right, and I basically wrote a month ago that I thought this was going to end up being a depression rather than a recession, which of course we are well overdue for. But think of it in these terms. I don't know about what it's like in the UK, but if you go to most any mall in America, you're going to see lots of empty stores. You're going to see malls that were a shadow of themselves. And when these stores are empty, they're not being replaced. So we've been witnessing the slow death of retail. Could this then be the precipitous fast death of retail, I'm wondering? Could we be left at the end of this thing with 2 or 3 Goliaths, the Amazons and the Walmarts and the Costcos of the world that prevail, and everybody else is wiped out? I mean, what about restaurants?
Right. Yeah.
How long are restaurants going to be able to survive without having customers? And on. The airlines. I mean,
hotels. Yeah.
Maybe what happens is these airlines are either nationalized in order to get equity to keep them afloat, or they go out of business, and what replaces them instead of private airlines are simply a state-owned airline, a single state-owned airline. Who knows?
Well,
we're just totally in uncharted territory.
Here's the thought. I mean, the European Central Bank lowered interest rates to 0.1%, I believe it was, this week. And we're running out of monetary ammunition. We've already run out of it after the global financial crisis. So really, I think that the only way out of this economically is through government spending and fiscal stimulus, and we're all going to become Keynesians.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I don't know what alternative there is. I mean, but the thing is, as I alluded to earlier, is that there's got to be a limit to how much money can actually be printed and how much stimulus can actually be provided.
Yeah.
And so I don't really know. The economists would know what the end game is here. But for now, what they're just trying to do is stem the bleeding. But I'm really humbled by the fact that we're at the beginning of the runway on this thing. We're not even midway down it.
Yeah, exactly.
So if it's this bad already, how bad will it get?
Right.
Another potential impact, of course, is that it's going to result in a consolidation of the housing market from people who live apart from their family to people who are forced to live with their family. And we'll, of course, likely see a repeat of all the homes that are going to go into foreclosure. It's just going to be ugly.
Yeah. Actually, it was the Bank of England that lowered rates by 0.1%. But every central bank is pretty much in the same place.
Oh, here we're at 0% already.
Yeah.
In the space of 2 movements in 2 weeks, they went from 1.75 down to 0.
Right. So it suggests to me, and perhaps we can come on to the U.S. election as a result of this, but really it has to be fiscal stimulus that gets the economy back on track. I mean, we've had a decade now of this low interest rate, quantitative easing approach, and it has had some but limited impact on the real economy. And now with this, it would suggest to me that governments need to open up the coffers and ring up the debt which
and they're very good at that, aren't they?
and they're very good at that. Well, they'll get better at it as well. But that's the thing. I mean, debt is for these kinds of situations, so it isn't very comforting. But that I just like to move that on to the U.S. election and what all of this means for Mr. Trump and for his opponents and the policy options and proposals that they might have at their disposal. I think Trump's approval rating has dipped to something like 37% in the past week as a result of this.
Yes, and that's surprising in a sense because I didn't think there was literally anything that he could do that his ardent supporters wouldn't approve of or would hold him accountable for. It had been as high as, I believe, 51% earlier this year. So that's a fairly precipitous drop. That all said, there is a rumor going around, a conspiracy theory, I suppose is how it's better put, that Mr. Trump may spin all of this so that he can say it's not possible to have an election in this kind of environment and may make a play to just stay in office.
Can he
you
do
may
that?
think, well, that's no, not by law.
But make a spin, right.
But but laws have been changed in times of crisis, and he wouldn't be the first leader to, maybe the first in American history that I'm aware of, to try to pull a stunt like that. So let's assume that he's not going to pull a stunt like that. I'm glad that the Democratic nominee looks like it's turning out to be Biden because I think most people felt he was the best prepared all along. And if he can keep from stumbling too badly, I mean, he certainly has the experience and people trust him. And a steady pair of hands is exactly what we need right now. So perhaps there's a viable alternative. But I don't even know how we go about formally nominating the guy. I mean, you can't have a crowd. How do you have a convention? Is everything going to be done virtually? And if it is that considered legitimate? I don't even know. How would they set it up between now and July? There's too many questions for which I don't have an answer. I don't think that there is a clear path toward the election at this point from either side. There are just too many complications, too many unforeseen potential paths that could be pursued. I don't even know how one could contemplate it.
Well, here's a darker thought on that is if you think back to the Vietnam War and the body count, right? As the body count starts to rise domestically and the pictures of the body count become apparent, that will be pretty stark and pretty visceral and pretty real.
Yeah,
for any incumbent administration, and that must go for anyone else who's up for public office anywhere in the country.
Agreed, and that's also doubly true for a population that's unaccustomed to seeing those kinds of pictures on TV.
Yeah. Okay. So let's try and lighten the darkness a little bit and think maybe what some positive thoughts or some hopeful thoughts perhaps around we've talked in the past about international cooperation, and if there's a catalyst for that, this could be it. Greater cooperation, sharing of information, because of these viruses that don't know anything about borders. This might be the example that we need. What do you think of that?
I do think there is reason to be optimistic on that front. I mean, I know that the Chinese and other countries are sharing their information on, not only, of course, on infection and death rates, but on the research that they're doing to try and find a vaccine. And I do think there is some coordination going on about that, not enough, but I think that's going to change with time. I do think in time also there will be fiscal coordination, certainly by the G7 and possibly some other bodies, for taking some collaborative action that will hopefully have some sort of meaningful positive impact. And I do think that it's going to focus minds and get us back to where we should be on some very basic levels. For instance, the concept of bipartisanship, which has been completely missing in the American political landscape for many, many years now. It's really fascinating to watch just how quickly the Democrats and Republicans have been able to focus their minds and get a bipartisan bill passed in a matter of days in the U.S. Congress of this magnitude. So we always knew it could be done, but I do agree with you that this is really going to focus minds and get us back to some of the basics that we should have been in to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. One of the things we didn't talk about so much is the impact on U.S.-China relations, which we've talked at length before, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think the Phase 1 trade agreement must be considered pretty much dead on arrival.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it assumed a normal state of relations for what it had become at the time, a few months ago, and that has all been completely changed. I don't know how the Chinese could possibly be expected to purchase 25, 30 billion, whatever the figure was, of agricultural goods from the U.S. now, although they may need it now more than ever, because, their own domestic supply chain will have broken down, and soon enough ours will too. So I don't see how that's going to happen. I don't see how anybody's going to be focusing much of any time on a Phase 2 agreement, on peace with North Korea, on the Middle East, or anything else, because everybody around the world is focused on this one issue now. So it's sort of like we're going to be put in a state of suspension on a multi-month basis on all these various issues.
Well, this is fluid and evolving, and this was a very good overview of what I think we should be thinking about beyond the immediate steps. So, Daniel, this is great. Thank you for joining me. And maybe
always a pleasure, Ben.
Maybe we should do this every couple of weeks or something, or every few weeks anyway, because this thing is going to morph and change fairly rapidly.
Well, I think it'd be a great benefit for the listeners if they had some perspective from a couple of risk guys like us who don't have an axe to grind, and we're independent, and we're not tied to any particular political philosophy or nation or anything like that. We just say what's on our mind.
Yeah, we do need that. So thank you very much for joining me, and we will chat soon.
Thanks, Ben.
Bye for now. All right, I hope you all found that insightful. We'll check in again on the state of the world with Daniel in the near future and provide more insights on the coronavirus pandemic. Please stay at home. Please practice social distancing, but also please connect virtually with each other and take care of yourselves. We will be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.